Hello again. One of the things you'll hear people talk about in research methods and in your dissertation is conceptual frameworks. And these can be very useful. I quite like them as visual tools because they're often a diagram. So a conceptual framework, as it says there, is an organising framework, and it helps you and your readers, because remember you're going to be presenting this in a report, it helps you and them to understand the elements of your research. So I tend to draw quite a lot of diagrams when I'm doing research because I'm quite visual. So I tend to think about the relationships between things in sort of little bubble diagrams that show linkages between different kinds of topic areas. So a conceptual framework is an often diagram, and it can be quite abstract. I've seen, sometimes you see quite beautiful ones that people create. I'm not very good at doing the beautiful, but, I quite like doing the thinking behind them. So there are different types of conceptual frameworks, and it depends much on whether you're doing deductive or inductive research, and whether it is qualitative or quantitative. So deductive research, which is typically quantitative, but not always, the conceptual framework usually guides the research design. So quite often at the end of your literature review, you might be able to create at least a preliminary conceptual framework. And then this would actually inform your study. So if you were doing something like quantitative observations or designing a questionnaire, it will inform the design of your questionnaire. Because what it does, it sets out the variables. Now, variables are, they could be something like a question in a questionnaire. They can be sort of things about people like their age or their gender, or it might be a variable might be an attitude statement. So it sets out these variables that you're interested in their relationship with one another. So I've got a classic one here. This is from Adjun's theory of planned behaviour that some of you might recognise. And it talks about a number of things that actually feed into people's intentions to behave in a particular way, and then ultimately their behaviour. So you've got the behaviour and attitude, so it's the way their attitude towards undertaking that behaviour. The subjective norms, so these are things about other people around them that make them think that they should do that behaviour. And perceived behavioural control, so this can be things that actually intervene and get in the way. So, that's a familiar example. And, I've seen a lot of students use this particular framework actually in studies when they're trying to understand whether people will undertake a particular kind of behaviour or not. Then if we actually look at inductive research, which is typically qualitative but doesn't always have to be, and as I keep saying, I do a lot of inductive research which is quantitative. The conceptual framework here typically emerges at the end of the research. Again, it's often a diagram or a table, and it somehow visually explains the patterns that are found in the data. And what it often does is proposes relationships that might be tested in later research. So quite a bit of the research I do, I often begin with qualitative research and use that to develop a conceptual framework. And then sometimes I go on and do some quantitative research to test it out. Okay, so the conceptual frameworks here can sometimes be more abstract and perhaps less specific. Now I'll show you one from my digital disconnection project, and this is what we found at the end of our qualitative research phase. So we were actually trying to, we'd noticed that a number of people were talking about disconnection when they were on holiday at a campsite, and we wanted to explore this further. And so we tried to explore the different kinds of disconnection that were going on. And we identified two very broad kinds. One was structural issues and one was personal discretion. And under structural issues, these were things like hardware considerations. So, for instance, there wasn't a very good signal at that campsite. At the time when we were doing this study, which was the early 2011-12, there was quite more difficult to charge mobile phones than it is now, particularly when you're camping. And also people were quite concerned. They'd just bought a 500 quid phone and they didn't want to lose it and get it damaged in a tourism context. So, there were some issues there. And we referred to that as forced disconnection. So it wasn't necessarily that they didn't want to be connected. It's just that they were having problems because of hardware issues. On the personal discretion side of things, there was personal preferences, and then interpersonal influences. Personal preferences were things to do with managing intrusion from work, escaping from day-to-day life and wanting to engage with the natural environment. And then on the interpersonal side, sometimes there are group tensions, so like parents not wanting their children to use mobile phones and therefore they didn't use them because they didn't want to demonstrate that behaviour to children. So that was part of that's the setting behaviour standards for children. The managing tensions was often between one adult and another adult in a group, not wanting the other one to be constantly on the phone. And there were also issues to do with maintaining connectivity at home. And so that led to chosen connectivity. And that was a framework that we then went on and tested in a quantitative study. So, the only difference really when we start thinking about conceptual frameworks, in qualitative and quantitative studies, is they tend to come in different places. So a conceptual framework in a qualitative study will tend to come at the end, whereas in a quantitative study it often comes at the start. But this is not fixed rules, so don't get kind of bogged down here, but that's just typically how it might work. So following this, you should now be able to move on and look at some of the recordings related to research methods.